Of all of the influential people of the latter half of the 20th century, Adlai Stevenson was certainly among the most significant. A humble governor from Illinois, Stevenson perfectly embodied the phrase, "Those most suited to power are those who have never sought it." At first, Stevenson refused bids for the presidency at every turn, accepting the Democratic nomination only after considerable pressure to do so. But from there on, the inspiring intellectual rose to become one of the most prominent figures in U.S. history by reinvigorating the Democratic Party base, and most importantly, delivering the world from the brink of destruction. In 1952, the Democratic National Convention was held in Illinois, the state of which Adlai Stevenson was governor. It was he, therefore, whose duty it was to give the welcoming speech to the delegates. By this point, despite publicly refusing requests for his entrance in the race, Stevenson had a large following of people who wanted him to run for president. Against his wishes, a number of his friends had even started the so-called Draft Stevenson movement, which campaigned to put Stevenson on the ballot. Some friends they were, but after Stevenson spoke at the convention, it wasn't just they who wanted him in the race. Stevenson had made more of an impression on the Democratic Party during the convention than the actual delegates. He'd attacked the Republican platform and reminded the disheartened Democrats of the achievements of the past two presidential terms. He renewed faith in their party aims and did it with such intellectualism and wit that he became a quick favorite for the Democratic candidate. With all of this backing, the decision was a clear one for Stevenson to finally enter the presidential race. During his campaign, Stevenson delivered energizing oratories that inspired Democrats in the same way that his welcome speech had at the National Convention. The party became more appealing to the youth of America, and the Democrats experienced growth as well as a surge in popularity. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., actual quote.
Stevenson was a great, creative figure in American politics. He turned the Democratic Party around in the 50s and made JFK possible to the United States and the world. He was the voice of a reasonable, civilized, and elevated America. He brought a new generation into politics and moved millions of people in the United States and around the world.
This was indeed true. Following the race, Democrats gained significant seats in Congress, signifying the resurgence of the party. Stevenson's most notable achievement, and also the one for which he is most under-recognized, was his role in ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October of 1962, U.S. reconnaissance aircraft observed suspicious military buildup on the island of Cuba, only 90 miles off the coast of U.S. soil. When it was determined that the buildup was in fact with Soviet nuclear warheads, the situation became dire. The positioning of the missiles was such that it gave the Soviets first strike capability, which would have severely weakened the U.S.'s military power in the Cold War by being under the threat of nuclear warheads that would be undetectable until it was too late. It was essential that the missiles be removed, but tensions between the two nations were only rising, and it looked as if the United States' only option was to invite escalation. That is, until Adlai Stevenson proposed a diplomatic alternative. He suggested that the United States strike a deal with the Soviet Union, trade the removal of the U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey for the Soviet ones in Cuba. He knew it was a risky proposal to make given the state of relations with the Soviet Union, but Stevenson's sense of morality transcended his fear of public ridicule. He said himself that, quote, "I know that most of those fellows will consider me a coward for the rest of my life for what I said today. But perhaps we need a coward in the room when we are talking about nuclear war." End quote. It was indeed lucky that Stevenson was brave enough to be a coward. Though he was dismissed at the time, this suggestion would come to have a lasting impact on the outcome of the crisis. Tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union only rose, until it looked as if nuclear war was imminent. What finally prompted the Soviets to agree to remove the missiles were two things. One, diplomatic pressure put on the Soviet Union by Adlai Stevenson during a meeting of the United Nations. And two, a secret deal to do exactly what Stevenson had earlier suggested, to remove U.S. missiles in Turkey for Soviet ones in Cuba. It was Adlai Stevenson who pushed for the option of diplomacy, who planted the idea of the missile exchange into the heads of the U.S. government. Without Stevenson's courageous ingenuity, the Cuban Missile Crisis likely would have ended very differently. It should also be noted that the peaceful resolution of the crisis produced a thaw in the Cold War by the eventual signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty by both nations, and the creation of a hotline between Washington, D.C. and Moscow so as to be able to resolve any further crises with better communication. Being largely responsible for this peaceful resolution, Stevenson deserves the credit for the ensuing thaw as well. Adlai Stevenson was inarguably one of the most significant figures of U.S. history, being responsible for both the re-energizing of the Democratic Party base in the 1950s and propelling it into the coming decades, and also for averting nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He shaped party politics in a lasting way, and with his exceptional diplomatic skills and rare moral integrity, Adlai Stevenson delivered the world from the brink of its destruction.